Tonight, Dillon's Radio Theater, Episode 3, presents two short stories by Ambrose Bierce. I'm your host, Craig K Dillon. The first is An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. Published in 1890, when it appeared, the story was immediately noticed for its technical daring. Over time, it became one of the most studied short stories in American literature, frequently cited for its influence on psychological realism and modern narrative structure. It is now considered Bierce's most famous work, and one of the earliest American stories to place perception itself at the center of the narrative. The second is A Horseman in the Sky, published in 1889. Like much of Bierce's fiction, it draws on first-hand experience as a Civil War veteran, but avoids the heroic tone common in 19th-century war writing. We begin with An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. A man stood upon a railway bridge in northern Alabama, looking down into the swift water 20 feet below. The man's hands were behind his back, the wrist bound with a cord. The rope closely circled his neck. It was attached to a stout cross timber above his head, and the slack fell to the level of his knees. Some loose boards lay upon the sleepers supporting the metals of the railway, supplied a footing for him and his executioners, two private soldiers of the Federal Army. Directed by a sergeant who in civil life may have been a deputy sheriff, at a short remove upon the same temporary platform was an officer in the uniform of his rank, armed. He was a captain. A sentinel at each end of the bridge stood with his rifle in a position known as support. That is to say, vertical in front of the left shoulder, the hammer resting on the forearm thrown across his chest. A formal and unnatural position, enforcing an erect carriage of the body. It did not appear to be the duty of these sentinels to know what was occurring at the center of the bridge. They merely blockaded the two ends of the foot planking that traversed it. Beyond one of the sentinels, nobody was in sight. The railroad ran straight away into a forest for 100 yards, then, curving, was lost to view. Doubtless there was an outpost further along. The other bank of the stream was open ground, a gentle acclivity topped with a stockade of vertical tree trunks, loopholed for rifles, with a single embrasure through which protruded the muzzles of a brass cannon commanding the bridge. Midway of the slope between bridge and fort were the spectators, a single company of infantry in line at parade rest, the butts of their rifles on the ground, the barrels inclining slightly backward against the right shoulder, the hands crossed upon the stock. A lieutenant stood at the right of the line, the point of his sword upon the ground, his left hand resting upon his right. Excepting the group of four at the center of the bridge, not a man moved. The company faced the bridge, staring stonily, motionless. The sentinels facing the banks of the stream might have been statues to adorn the bridge. The captain stood with folded arms, silent, observing the work of his subordinates, but making no sign. Death is a dignitary who, when he comes announced, is to be received with formal manifestations of respect, even by those most familiar with him. In the code of military etiquette and fixity are forms of deference. The man who was engaged in being hanged was apparently about 35 years of age. He was a civilian, if one might judge from his habit, which was that of a planter. His features were good, a straight nose, firm mouth, broad forehead, from which his long, dark hair was combed straight back, falling upon his ears to the collar of his well-fitted frock coat. He wore a mustache and pointed beard, but no whiskers. His eyes were large and dark gray and had a kindly expression which one would hardly have expected in one whose neck was in the hemp. Evidently, this was no vulgar assassin. The liberal military code makes provision for hanging many kinds of persons, and gentlemen are not excluded. The preparations being complete, the two private soldiers stepped aside, and each drew away the plank upon which he had been standing. The sergeant turned to the captain, saluted, and placed himself immediately behind the man, who remained motionless. The captain nodded to the sergeant. The sergeant stepped aside. By the weight of his body, the man sank down. The slack of the rope felt suddenly taut and snapped the back of his neck. He was dead. At this point, Bierce famously fractures time and perception. The following section resumes exactly as written. As Peyton Farquhar fell straight downward through the bridge, he lost consciousness and was as one already dead. From the state he was awakened, ages later, it seemed to him, by the pain of a sharp pressure upon his throat, followed by a sense of suffocation. Keen, poignant agonies seemed to shoot from his neck downward through every fiber of his body and limbs. These pains appeared to flash along well-defined lines of ramification and to beat with an inconceivably rapid periodicity. There seemed like streams of pulsating fire heating him to an intolerable temperature. As to his head, he was conscious of nothing but a feeling of fullness, of congestion. These sensations were unaccompanied by thought. The intellectual part of his nature was already effaced. He had power only to feel, and feeling was torment. He was conscious of motion, encompassed in a luminous cloud of which he was now merely the fiery heart. Without material substance, he swung through the unthinkable arcs of oscillation like a vast pendulum. Then, all at once, with a terrible suddenness, the light about him shot upward with the noise of a loud splash. The frightful roaring was in his ears, and all was cold and dark. The power of thought was restored. He knew that the rope had broken and he had fallen into the stream. He did not open his eyes, but waited until the fierce pain subsided, then looked about him. He was now lying on his side, free from the rope. The water was flowing swiftly over him, and he felt himself drifting with the current. His brain was as alert as ever. He saw everything with a dreadful distinctness. He heard the ripples upon the river, the beating of his own heart, and the distinct strokes of the oars of the guardsmen who were trying to capture him. He saw the bridge, the fort, the soldiers. He felt the cool water upon his face and hands. He swam vigorously, using his hands only, keeping his head above water. He was safe. He felt relief, almost exultation. He saw the flash of a gun. He heard the report. The ball struck the water within a few inches of his head. A cannon boomed. The grape shot tore the water into foam around him. He dived, sank, swam again, rose, fled. Hours later, or what seemed hours, he found himself in the forest, safe, unpursued. The road led homeward. His wife and children awaited him. As he walked, he felt a strange stiffness in his neck, a dull pain that increased gradually until it became unbearable. A blinding white light blazed all about him. The sound of a sharp blow rang out, and all was darkness and silence. Peyton Farquhar was dead. His body, with a broken neck, swung gently from side to side beneath the timbers of the Owl Creek Bridge. The next story, by Ambrose Bierce, is A Horseman in the Sky. One sunny afternoon in the autumn of the year 1861, a soldier lay in a clump of laurel by his side of a road in western Virginia. He lay at full length upon his stomach, his feet resting upon the toes, his head upon his left forearm. He extended the right, loosely grasped his rifle, but for somewhat methodical disposition of his limbs and a slight rhythmic movement of the cartridge box at the back of his belt, he might have been thought to be dead. He was asleep at his post of duty, but if detected, he would be dead shortly afterward, death being the just and legal penalty for his crime. The clump of laurel in which the criminal lay was in the angle of a road, which, after ascending southward a steep acclivity to that point, returned sharply to the west, running along the summit for perhaps 100 yards. There it turned south again, and went zigzagging downward through the forest. At the salient of that second angle was a large, flat rock, jutting out northward, overlooking the deep valley from which the road ascended. The rock capped a high cliff. A stone dropped from its outer edge would have fallen sheer downward 1,000 feet to the top of the pines. The angle where the soldier lay was on another spur of the same cliff. Had he been awake, he would have commanded a view not only of the short arm of the road and the jutting rock, but of the entire profile of the cliff below. It may have well made him giddy to look. The country was wooded everywhere except at the bottom of the valley to the northward, where there was a small natural meadow through which flowed a stream scarcely visible from the valley's rim. This open ground looked hardly larger than an ordinary dooryard, but was really several acres in extent. Its green was more vivid than that of the enclosing forest. Away beyond it rose a line of giant cliffs, similar to those upon which we are supposed to stand in our survey of the savage scene, and through which the road had somehow made its climb to the summit. The configuration of the valley, indeed, was such that from this point of view of observation it seemed entirely shut in, and one could but have wondered how the road which had found a way out of it had found a way into it, and whence came and whither went the waters of the stream that parted the meadow more than 1,000 feet below. No country is so wild and difficult, but men will make it a theater of war, concealed in the forest at the bottom of what that military rat trap in which 100 men in possession of the exits might have starved an army into submission, lay 5 regiments of Federal infantry. They had marched all the previous day and night and were resting. At nightfall they would take to the road again, climb to the place where their unfaithful sentinel now slept, and descending the other slope of the ridge, fall upon a camp of the enemy at about midnight. Their hope was to surprise it, for the road led to the rear of it. In case of failure, their position would be perilous in the extreme, and fail they surely would, should accident or vigilance surprise the enemy of the movement. The sleeping sentinel in a clump of laurel was a young Virginian named Carter Druce. He was the son of wealthy parents, an only child, and had known such ease in cultivation and high living as wealth and taste were able to command in the mountain country of western Virginia. His home was but a few miles from where he now lay. One morning he had risen from the breakfast table and said, quietly but gravely, "Father, a Union regiment has arrived in Crafton. I am going to join it." The father lifted his leonine head, looked at his son a moment in silence, and replied, "Well, go, sir, and whatever may occur, do what you conceive to be your duty. Virginia, to which you are a traitor, must get on without you. Should we both live to the end of the war, we will speak further of the matter. Your mother, as a physician, has informed you, is in the most critical condition. At the best, she cannot be with us longer than a few weeks, but that time is precious. It would be better not to disturb her." So Carter Druce, bowing reverently to his father, who returned the salute with a stately courtesy that masked a breaking heart, left the home of his childhood to go soldiering. By conscience and courage, by deeds of devotion and daring, he soon commended himself to his fellows and his officers, and it was to these qualities and to some knowledge of the country that owed his selection for his present perilous duty at the extreme outpost. Nevertheless, fatigue had been stronger than resolution, and he had fallen asleep. What good or bad angel came in a dream to rouse him from his state of crime? Who shall say? Without a movement, without a sound, in the profound silence and languor of the late afternoon, some invisible messenger of fate touched with unsealing finger the eyes of the consciousness, whispering into the ear of his spirit the mysterious and awakening word which no human lips ever have spoken, no memory ever has recalled. He quietly raised his forehead from his arm and looked between the masking stems of the laurels, instinctively closing his right hand about the stock of his rifle. His first feeling was a keen artistic delight. On a colossal pedestal of the cliff, motionless in the extreme edge of the capping rock and sharply outlined against the sky, was an equestrian statue of impressive dignity. The figure of a man sat at the figure of a horse, straight and soldierly, but with the repose of a Grecian god carved in marble, which limits the suggestion of activity. The gray costume harmonized with its aerial background. The metal of the accoutrement and caparison was softened and subdued by the shadow. The animal's skin had no points of highlight. The carbine, striking foreshortened, lay across the pommel of the saddle, kept in place by the right hand grasping it at the grip. The left hand holding the bridle rein was invisible. In silhouette against the sky, the profile of the horse was cut with the sharpness of a cameo. It looked across the heights of air to the confronting cliffs beyond. The face of the rider, turned slightly away, showed only an outline of temple and beard. He was looking downward to the bottom of the valley. Magnified by its lift against the sky and by the soldiers' testifying sense of formidableness of a near enemy, the group appeared of a heroic, almost colossal size. For an instant, Druce had a strange, half-defined feeling that he had slept to the end of the war and was looking upon a noble work of art, reared upon that eminence to commemorate the deeds of an heroic past of which he had been an inglorious part. The feeling was dispelled by a slight movement of the group. The horse, without moving its feet, had drawn its head slightly backward from the verge. The man remained immobile as before. Broad awake and keenly alive to the significance of the situation, Druce now brought the butt of his rifle against his cheek by cautiously pushing the barrel forward through the bushes, cocked the piece, and glancing through the sights, covered a vital spot of the horseman's breast. A touch upon the trigger, and all would have been well with Carter Druce. In that instant, the horseman turned his head and looked in the direction of the concealed foeman, seemed to look into his very face, into his eyes, into his brave, compassionate heart. Is it then so terrible to kill an enemy in war, an enemy who has surprised a secret vital to the safety of oneself and comrades, an enemy more formidable for his knowledge than all his army for its numbers? Carter Druce looked pale. He shook in every limb, turned faint, and saw the statuesque group before him as black figures rising, falling, moving unsteadily in arcs of circles in the fiery sky. His hand fell away from his weapon. His head slowly dropped until his face rested on the leaves in which he lay. This courageous gentleman and hardy soldier was near swooning from intensity of emotion. It was not for long. In another moment, his face was raised from the earth, his hands resumed their place to the rifle, his forefinger sought the trigger. Mind, heart, and eyes were clear, conscious, and reason sound. He could not hope to capture that enemy. To alarm him would but send him dashing to his camp with his fatal news. The duty of the soldier was plain. The man must be shot dead from ambush, without warning, without a moment's spiritual preparation. With never so much as an unspoken prayer, he must be sent to his account. But no, there is a hope. He may have discovered nothing. Perhaps he is but admiring the sublimity of the landscape. If permitted, he may turn and ride carelessly away in the direction whence he came. Surely it would be possible to judge at the instant of his withdrawing whether he knows. It may well be that his fixity of attention— Druce turned his head and looked through the deeps of the air downward, as from the surface to the bottom of a translucent sea. He saw creeping across the green meadows a sinuous line of figures of men and horses. Some foolish commander was permitting the soldiers of his escort to water their beasts in the open, in plain view from a dozen summits. Druce withdrew his eyes from the valley and fixed them upon the group of men and horse in the sky. And again it was through these sights of his rifle. But this time his aim was at the horse. In his memory, as if they were a divine mandate, rang the words of his father at their parting. Whatever may occur, do what you conceive to be your duty. He was calm now. His teeth were firmly but not rigidly closed. His nerves were as tranquil as a sleeping babe's. Not a tremor affected any muscle of his body. His breathing, until suspended in the act of taking aim, was regular and low. Duty had conquered. The spirit had said to the body, "Peace, be still." He fired. An officer of the federal force who, in a spirit of adventure or in quest of knowledge, had left in the hidden bivouac in the valley and with aimless feet had made his way to the lower edge of a small open space near the foot of a cliff, was considering what he had to gain by pushing his exploration further. At a distance of a quarter mile before him, but apparently at a stone's throw, rose the fringe of pines, that the gigantic face of rock, towering so great a height above him that it made him giddy to look up where its edge cut a sharp, rugged line against the sky. It presented a clean vertical profile against a background of blue sky to point halfway down, half the way down, and of distant hills, hardly less blue, thence to the tops of the trees at its base. Lifting his eyes to the dizzy altitude of its summit was the officer, saw an astonishing sight, a man on horseback riding down into the valley through the air. Straight upright sat the rider, in military fashion, with a firm seat in the saddle, a strong clutch upon the rein to hold the charger from too impetuous a plunge, and from his bare head his long hair streamed upward, waving like a plume. His hands were concealed in the cloud of the horse's lifted mane. The animal's body was as level as if every hoof stroke encountered the resistance of earth. Its motions were those of a wild gallop, but even as the officer looked, they ceased, with all the legs thrown sharply forward as if in an act of alighting from a leap. But this was a flight. Filled with amazement and terror by his apparition of a horseman in the sky, half believing himself to be the chosen scribe of some new apocalypse, the officer was overcome by the intensity of the emotion. His legs failed him, and he fell. Almost at the same instant, he heard a crashing sound in the trees, a sound that died without an echo, and all was still. The officer rose to his feet, trembling. The familiar sensation of an abraded shin recalled his dazed faculties. Pulling himself together, he ran rapidly, obliquely away from the cliff to a point distant from its foot. Thereabout expected to find his man, and thereabout he naturally failed. In the fleeting instant of his vision, his imagination had been so wrought upon the apparent grace and ease of intention of the marvelous performance that it did not occur to him that the line of march, the aerial cavalry as it descended downward, that he could find the objects of his search at the very foot of the cliff. Half an hour later, he returned to camp. This officer was a wise man. He knew better than to tell an incredible truth. He said nothing of what he had seen. But when the commander asked him if in his scout he had learned anything of the advantage to the expedition, he answered, "Yes, sir. There's no road leading down to the valley from the southward." The commander, knowing better, smiled. After firing his shot, Private Carter Drews reloaded his rifle and resumed his watch. 10 minutes later had already passed when a federal sergeant crept cautiously to him on hands and knees. Drews neither turned his head nor looked at him, but lay without motion or sign of recognition. "Did you fire?" the sergeant whispered. "Yes." "At what?" "A horse. It was standing on yonder rock pretty far out. You see, it is no longer there. It went over the cliff." The man's face was white, but he showed no other sign of emotion. Having answered, he turned his eyes away and said no more. The sergeant did not understand. "See here, Drews," he said after a moment's silence, "it's no use making a mystery. I ordered you to report. Was there anybody on that horse?" "Yes." "Well?" "My father." The sergeant rose to his feet and walked away. "Good God," he said. Curator's notes. Ambrose Bierce and Two Civil War Stories. Both of tonight's stories were written by Ambrose Bierce near the end of the 1880s, long after the Civil War itself, but by a man who had fought in it and carried its imprint for the rest of his life. A Horseman in the Sky was first published in 1889, and an Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge followed shortly after in 1890. At the time, Bierce was already known for his sharp wit and cynicism, but these stories marked him as something rarer, a writer willing to strip a war of sentiment without replacing it with moral instruction. Initial inception was strong but uneasy. Readers recognized the craftsmanship immediately, yet many were unsettled by the tone. These were not patriotic war tales, nor were they protest pieces. Bierce offered no reassurance, no uplift, no clear moral framing, which placed him outside of the dominant literary tradition of post-war reconciliation writing. Over time, both stories became foundational. An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge is now widely cited as one of the earliest and most influential examples of psychological realism in American short fiction, studied for its technical daring and narrative control. A Horseman in the Sky became a standard text for examining ethical conflict in war literature, notable for its restraint and compression rather than rhetoric. Together, these stories helped move American fiction away from romanticized war narratives and toward a colder, more modern sensibility, one that treats war as a condition that distorts judgment, time, and responsibility rather than as a proven ground for virtue. By the early 20th century, Bierce's influence had been seen in writers who rejected moralized storytelling altogether, paving the way for later modernist and realist treatments of violence and authority. Ambrose Bierce would later vanish under very mysterious circumstances in Mexico around 1914. His final known letter ends with this line: "As to me, I leave here tomorrow for an unknown destination." His body was never found, fitting, perhaps, for a writer so preoccupied with the thin line between life, death, and disappearance. Thank you for listening to this episode of Dillon's Radio Theater. I wanted to take a moment to explain how this theater operates and what you can expect as you continue listening. Dillon's Radio Theater is a curated project. The stories you hear are selected deliberately by suitability of story, quality, author's literary contribution, narrative strength, and lasting value. Dillon's Radio Theater presents classic public domain works that are performed as complete texts. In the case of children's folk tales, the earliest versions of those stories are always used. Children's stories are not softened or sanitized for modern sensibilities. Miles McGee, Private Investigator, is part of Dillon's Radio Theater and follows the same principles. Miles McGee, Private Investigator, is an original fiction-evoking noir style pulp detective story from an earlier era, all of those set in modern-day Pittsburgh. Dillon's Radio Theater is listener-supported. Occasional future episodes will be freely available on YouTube. The full Dillon's Radio Theater library will be available by subscription on Patreon and the podcast services Patreon uses, such as Spotify. If Dillon's Radio Theater appeals to you, I invite you to explore the library on Patreon. The library is constantly expanding, and if you'd like to hear specific authors or stories, please indicate so in the comments. Thank you. Craig K Dillon.